asking you to create a specific system. With the artists, why does this piece of art does not integrate to the game system that I'm trying to program? Obviously with the testers, they found a bug, you need to make changes, and the writers. And just like anything in the game industry, just because you say I'm a games programmer, it doesn't really mean specific categories in games programming. You start as a generalist, but then you can specifically target gameplay programming. So the system is like, I'm shooting a bullet, what happens? How does the physics interact with the projectile that I just shot? You could be a UI UX programmer, so you're just focusing on the functionality with the elements on the screen that the player is trying to click, right? Then you have AI programmer, which is kind of self-explanatory. How does the AI in my game work? This could be linked to outside things like, how do I integrate machine learning into my game, right? And a bunch more. The next thing that you could get into is game designer. And this is sort of where we have to draw a line between what a programmer is and what a designer is. You think of a programmer as the person implementing, with some authority, systems that a designer thought of, right? These are the people that are, if I could generalize, the architects of the game world, the game that you're making. These are the visionaries, the people that are gonna think of how things should be. So we're talking about the people that are gonna design the gameplay experience. How does player go from point A to point B? What should they be doing between these points, right? These are the people that are gonna be designing the levels, so a level designer. These are the people that are gonna be thinking of the puzzles, right? These are the people that ensure that the game is engaging for the player throughout its duration, okay? And then of course, communication is key as with any of these career paths that you could be following. And of course, game design is not just some general thing. You usually have to split it into different types of people, different teams. So you have the gameplay designers, again, for those specific systems. You have the UI UX, you have the level designers. And then of course you have sort of the highest point you could reach as a game designer, which is a game director. You're effectively the captain of the ship. You're steering where the game is gonna go, right? It's basically like a movie director, but for the game. Next up, we have game art, game artists. Now you might think that this is very similar to just general art in other fields, but that's not really the case, because the thing that the player sees is not necessarily the thing that inspired the people that made it, right? So as an artist, you have different types of responsibilities. You have artists that are going to create, again, art to inspire. The game designer thought of something, the programmer tried to implement something. What was the basis to do that? How do I know what the game is going to look like before I make it? Because obviously it's very expensive. Concept art is a great way to just sort of start visualizing what the game is going to look like in the end stages. Then of course, as a game artist, you have to be able to draw characters, environments, a bunch of different things. And this doesn't mean in 2D only. You might have to be doing stuff in 3D, say Blender for 3D modeling or Maya. And then of course communication is key. Whatever the artist is doing needs to go back to the programmer. Is the thing that I just created feasible to put in the game? Is it too difficult to draw? Is it just not possible in the graphics budget that you have? We're talking about I don't know, like a Switch, or maybe you're just targeting Steam Deck, right? We're talking about specific hardware limitations that artists have to be aware of. And then of course, this goes back into different types of artists. You have the concept artists that are going to be critical in the beginning, the startup stage of the game. You have technical artists, and these are the guys that are going to be combining programming, say Python, with some level of creative art for the game. You have the environment artists, and these are the ones that are going to be populating the levels with different art pieces. You have character artists and a bunch more. So, of course, this is just a very brief overview of like what a character artist is. This goes much, much deeper into modelers, goes deeper into rigging and a bunch of different things. I am generalizing here, but it's just like one aspect that you can follow. Then you have game testers and QA. Now this is sort of an undervalued role, especially when you're thinking about what goes into making games and where are the people making them. These are sort of the backbone of functional games. Without them, you don't get a good game. That's just the way of how everything works. And it's not as recognized as the rest of the roles. And the reason for that is because these are the sort of the first line of defense in finding bugs, in telling you that this literally doesn't work when you're implementing a system. But more than that, these are the people that are going to tell you that yes, everything works fine, but the system you just made is not fun. I don't like playing the game you just made. These are the first people that are going to be telling you this as a programmer, as a designer, as an artist, as everything, right? And of course, again, communication. These are the people that need to be able to tell the programmer, the director, the writer, why their decision just isn't working in the context of this specific game, right? And of course, this goes down to different types of testing. You have obviously generalized QA that can test everything, but then you have people specifically looking for gameplay problems, right? Why does the flow of gameplay not work very well? Why does the level not feel good? Should I change the level design? Or maybe performance testing, like everything works fine, but I'm running at 20 FPS and I just cannot enjoy the game at that frame rate, right? And next we have game writing, which is again a very, might sound like rather obvious, it's just like any other writing field, but the reality is game writing is very different to any other form of writing, specifically because in any other form of media, the player doesn't have any agency, doesn't have authority. In a movie, you always see what the director wants you to see. You'll always hear exactly what the people that make the movie want you to hear. But that's not the case in games. As a game writer, you need to understand that the way you're going to create the world that the players live in is very different, right? You need to account for, how do I present this to the player? Is it going to be a cutscene? Is it going to be ambient dialogue? Is it the player walking on a street and then they just hear some dialogue in the background? How important is that? How do I deliver that, right? And as a writer, you need to really understand both the game systems as well as how your writing goes into the game, right? And then of course, again, communication. You need to be able to communicate with everyone else that is contributing to the creation of this game. Of course, as writer, you have a bunch of different roles. You could be the lore expert, the person that makes sure that between scene to scene or game to game, there's cohesion, there's sense to, you can understand what is happening, right? You're not seeing specific facts erasing other facts between game entries. You have dialogue writing. How does dialogue flow from one conversation to the other? Is there choice in dialogue? Maybe if the player made action A, then I get dialogue B instead of C, right? And then you have just general narrative writing. How does the player go from act 1 to 2 to 3, depending on how the game is structured? So, the thing that I highlighted in basically all of these slides is communication. Even if you're making a game on your own, you need to be able to communicate with other people. Because even again, as a solo developer, you don't know everything, right? You need to be able to go on a forum and explain your vision, your problem, your desire to make or do something, right? So just like any other sector, but especially in game making, communication is like one of the most important skills you can have. So these are some career paths. I'm not an expert in most of them other than, or at least I don't have expertise in most of them other than games programming. So let's talk a little bit about what path you should follow on an educational and maybe skill development level to get into the industry. For programming, these are some obvious things. In terms of languages that are most often used, are these commercial ones. You have stuff like C++ in, say, Unreal Engine, C# and Unity. Some engines use Python or some frameworks. If you use something like Godot, you might see GScript. There's a bunch of different things, but most of them are usually C-based or C-like. Then, obviously, you need to understand the math behind games. Math, physics, very important in making games, especially if you're looking at making something that is real-time, right? Not just turn-based. Then, of course, as I said in the beginning, problem solving. Everything that you're gonna come across in games is usually a unique situation. You can look up a tutorial, but at the end of the day, you're making your game or somebody else's game. So the thing you just encountered is probably a problem that only you have faced once, right? So you need to understand, how do I problem solve? And the last thing, which is also very important, is, and this is not as obvious maybe in university, is when you get into the industry, any industry in software really, but especially game making, you're gonna be using other people's code, other people's frameworks. Because making games is hard, and you're not gonna be starting just a notepad and start writing C++, right? You're gonna be using some engine that somebody else built with some sensibilities, some basics that they expect you to understand and use, so you need to be able to quickly learn and understand these frameworks depending on where you go. And the other thing is, you need to be creative. Everything that I said might sound like very obvious, but you need to be thinking outside the box. Whenever you're making or implementing a solution in games, you need to be creative about your approach, because at the end of the day, games are art, right? So you need to be able to have your own vision of whatever it is that you're doing imprinted into the game itself. So, I spoke about collaboration to a great length, nothing new here, but basically, yeah, if you can collaborate, please do that. Then if you're making a game on your own, if you can find someone that just is an expert in an area that you are not, it's good, you'll learn stuff. So, we spoke about different sort of career paths. How do I study for them, right? For games programming, the obvious one is computer science. You start a computer science degree, that is a degree that you can then use to take you into the games industry in games programming. There are game programming degrees specifically. I would kind of advise against it simply because that just limits you to one facet of programming, but that doesn't mean that nothing bad about it. For game writing, then you have there are specific resources and maybe even game writing degrees depending on the country you live in, but in general you just study something that's more generic and you try to sort of get experience in writing for games if you want to get into that sector of the industry. Then you have game design. Game design is a very, again, peculiar thing because yes, you can study for game design at a university level, but the best game designers are usually the ones that come from some other background. So they started as programmers and then they went into game design. They started as QA and went into game design because they got experience in making games as something else, and then they were able to transfer those skills into game design. And then for QA roles, you don't really study for QA. You become a QA engineer as maybe just by testing games, by having knowledge in the industry. That's not really something you study for. Okay, so we've talked about, okay, I can study this, I can do that, but what can I do beyond just going to university or taking some courses to learn about games? Well, the obvious thing is game jams, right? Game jams are just competitions within a limited time frame. I think it's specified 24/72, but it can be any time frame. This is a fantastic way to see where you're at. What can I make either on my own or a very small team in a very limited time? It's not about making the next best game, but it really shows your creativity. It really shows what you can do, especially with limited resources. I know in Cyprus that we had the Global Game Jam, which was hosted at European University, I think.
Yes.
Which was if you could have participated in that, I think that's a fantastic way of seeing where you're at, learning about games, meeting new people. But if not, then you can just participate online. If you go on itch.io, you have a bunch of game jams running every single week. Participate in choose one, make a game, submit it, see where you're at. Next, of course, you have a bunch of free resources. This is a great way to see, okay, I want to maybe solve this specific problem in making a game, but I just want to also learn about games in general. And these are just some that are very well known. The ones I've used before. Nothing to highlight here other than maybe Twitter, now X, has a bunch of devs that share knowledge that is just never going to show up in forums or YouTube videos. So definitely look out for people on social media sharing knowledge about game making. So next, we have, as I spoke before, about frameworks, things that get you started in the industry, and maybe knowledge that you can use when getting into commercial game making. And these frameworks, or at least some of them, are Unreal Engine, Unity, especially lately Godot, and these are fantastic ways of sort of starting to get into game making, but also creating knowledge for yourself that you can then use and apply when trying to enter the game industry properly, not just for yourself. So why would I use these engines? Well, for one, Unreal Engine, obviously very well known. It's used by the biggest games in the industry. It's going to be used by upcoming games like, obviously, we have Final Fantasy Integrate, we have Remake Part 2, forgetting the name, the next Witcher game, the next Cyberpunk, a bunch of games are going to be using this engine. Obviously, Fortnite itself uses it. It's in many ways the biggest AAA engine in the industry. Another reason to use it is because it's open source, meaning that if you really want to, you can just see how everything works. You can go at the GitHub repository, you can see how the engine is made. It's fantastic for multiplayer because there's a bunch of built-in capabilities for networking. Visual scripting is another benefit, especially if you want to do something quickly without really understanding how C++ works in Unreal Engine. You can just use nodes to create behavior, right, instead of writing code, which you can see at the top there. So, for example, you're looking at a branch node, which is basically an if statement, but instead of writing it in text, you write it visually. Then the Epic Games Store has a lot of free and paid content that you can be either inspired by or use as examples for learning, especially the free stuff from Epic themselves. They have a bunch of sample projects that you can just open and see how the people that made the engine made actual games. Then you have Unity, which, okay, a bunch of controversy, especially lately around Unity. You can replace what I'm saying here with Godot, and you're probably gonna be just fine. But it has excellent documentation and support aspect. That's not necessarily a benefit of the engine or the people making the engine, but rather the people using it. Because so many people use Unity, there's a bunch of tutorials, a bunch of resources that you can find and use when making your own game. And it's also favored in the indie scene, especially in years past, because of a favorable pricing model, maybe not so much anymore. Then, obviously, you have great tutorials via Unity Learn. This is a great way to sort of get into game making because Unity themselves will walk you through how do I use the engine to make a game. They have the different types of games, like a top-down RPG or an FPS game. They also have started projects that you can just sort of grab as is and then extend them to see where you're at with using the engine. Visual scripting is part of the engine, much less so than Unreal, but you can get away without using code, using Bolt, which is now built into the engine. Basically, again, just dragging nodes that replaces programming. And then you obviously have the Unity asset store, like one of the biggest asset stores in terms of either buying or getting free assets for your game without having to make them, especially if you're into programming but maybe not into art. So, we've spoken at length, like, okay, I'm in the industry, I'm bored of the industry. What do I do now? Like, I have a bunch of skills with the latest tech. Where can I go? Well, the reality is, because you're using the latest and greatest in tech, and because you're effectively looking at simulated worlds in game making, you can go to a bunch of different things. For example, VR and AR, usually powered by hardware that is the same as gaming. And if you're going to be using this stuff and you understand how to code for a graphics card, you understand how you can create a simulation for surgery. Pilots already use Microsoft Flight Simulator to see how would I fly this plane in adverse conditions, right? So there's a bunch of different sectors you can go into, having knowledge from the games industry without having that specific sector be in the industry itself. So yeah, that's it. Questions?
Any questions?
Doesn't have to be about the presentation, can be anything about anything.
What is I heard about the project.
Right, so we created a research team, specifically the engine team. We are a team that specializes in creating prototypes for games. So this is, I'm making a small section, contained section of the game to see, is this viable to go, like, become a full product.
And you use this type of engines, you don't have your own, right?
We have our own, have used it, but we also
Is that what?
Unreal.
Unreal.
So I know most game dev companies usually they have their own game, or the big ones.
Some of them yes, some of them no. The reason you'd have your own engine is because you want to, well, okay, one, having Unreal is free for you and me on a like individual level, but if you start making over $1 million a year, you get charged, right? But a lot of companies are now switching away from having their own engine because it's just too hard to maintain.
So is the cost of paying for Unreal lower than actually running your own?
It depends on the person, it depends on the team, right? If you want to make a game engine, you're usually gonna make something very specific for the games you want to make, right? Maybe Unreal is just not the best for it. But if you're trying to make general games and those games happen to be the ones that Unreal makes the best, you might switch, like CD Projekt Red that made The Witcher, Cyberpunk, like a huge company, switched away from their own engine to Unreal because they thought that the cost of maintaining their own engine with a dedicated team was going to be higher than just paying the 5% royalty fee.
Isn't having your own engine and your own dedicated team easier to troubleshoot problems? So let's say if you're programming in Unreal, you can just go to the Unreal developers and ask them.
Well, funnily enough, if you're a big enough company, you can. They have a service for this that you pay for. But it also means that an engine that is made to be used by everyone is usually one that is better tested and there's more resources, right? Because if I have a question and that person to answer the question either has left the company or isn't available today, there's no one to ask. But if I'm asking a specific thing and I'm asking it in Unreal Engine, then someone somewhere on the internet can probably answer.
That's true.
What a data analyst, data scientist can impact the development of a gamer in the face of developing the game. Yeah.
So I'll bring it as an example, a game that sold like insane amounts, which is Baldur's Gate 3. So Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access, so people could play it before it was released for about 2 years, I think, maybe more.
Oh, yeah.
In that period of time, the developers had set up basically telemetry in the game that told them most players died here. Not enough players found this, which was a secret area. This thing that was found did not have the impact we expected. So you can use this sort of telemetry data by monitoring player activity to come to decisions about how do I change the game. So if I have a secret in the game, but it's so secret nobody finds it, maybe I want to change how players find that. right? If something is too difficult because everybody died in a specific spot, maybe I want to change the difficulty of that specific encounter, right? So you can use it actively that way. Another example is in Call of Duty, they have, and in many games really, and in many competitive games, they have some skill-based matchmaking system. And that can be a scoring system, but it can also be used, or a data, like a machine learning data science-based algorithm can be applied to it. For example, how do I match players with similar skill levels, right? And this happens by analyzing player data from existing matches. So depending on the thing you want to do as data science, that you can impact the player experience directly or indirectly, a bunch of different fields.
Thank you very much.
So how is a day in your life?
That's a good question. That's a good question. That's a good question.
I wake up, I come to work,
Yeah.
I sit at my desk, and usually I either debug or code, or have a chat with the people that are expecting a specific feature to be implemented. So that's basically it. And sometimes give presentations, yes. Communication is important whenever you need to speak with people, yes.
You keep mentioning communication, but this also extends outside with communicating with your player base or your community. How often do you feel like maybe the team cannot reach the expectations of players, or something that players ask for change all your plans, or something that you publish turns out in a week, oh, they hate it. We have to go backwards and redo everything. How often does this happen? Or how difficult is it to keep up with their demands?
I think that it's important to sort of like be able to, like, I'm not an expert in this, but like you need to be able to understand the difference between the minority of a specific community that's like very vocal, right? So you're gonna hear the complaints of the Twitter people, the Reddit people, right? But if the statistics of your game show that that's not really an issue, you obviously don't respond to that, right? You have the other case where maybe the players didn't like something, but if that's the game directors or just people vision, that's the game, right? You're not gonna change that. Now, in cases where you are specifically looking for player feedback, like in a competitive game, where it's all about the player experience, I think it's more about why was a change made and why did people not like it, right? So if a change was made because something was really just busted in the game, like it's broken, overpowered, whatever, right? And you change it, then everybody was using it and everybody's like, no, we want it back. Maybe that's something you ignore. But if it's a case where you see player just not playing the game anymore, they're just like the numbers are dropping off, in that case, then okay, you need to respond, maybe not even in direct communication, but just make something, you know.
Yeah, if in your job you have to do something that you know it's not that idea. Do you have the freedom to present your idea and be here?
So,
do something
like a design feature, for example, that
yeah,
you have to implement?
yeah.
Yes, I mean, there's never been a case where if somebody thinks something is really bad, their opinion cannot be heard, but that doesn't mean that it's going to change something, right? You can have an opinion as a programmer about a design feature, but if the designer really adamantly wants that, then you have to like just come to like concession, right? So you definitely have the freedom to voice opinion. There's in no way sort of an imbalancing status between like designer and programmer. That's why you need communication. If something just really doesn't work in the game, in your opinion, then you need to be able to communicate with your designer.
So going over after Nick's question, essentially the games development over the years has changed drastically in this sector, because we're seeing a lot of companies actually making games for profit and not to actually make good games that will please the players. What would you say as a programmer needs to change so that the programmers or the creators have more say, let's say, in the development, and not just, hey, do this because it makes money?
Well, you need to stop buying the thing that makes money.
Yeah, let's take that out of the equation. What needs to change inside the industry?
I mean, okay, the first thing is you see a lot of heads in especially publicly traded companies not be people with a degree or a background in making games. They're business people, right? Personally, you see this makes more money than this, then you don't care what the other thing is. It just makes more money, right? But it really comes down to the players. You're saying that I don't like microtransactions in whatever game, but if everybody keeps buying them, they're gonna keep putting microtransactions in the game, right? Nobody likes loot boxes, but everybody keeps opening them, so they keep putting them in the games, right? That's just like everybody says Call of Duty needs to change, but everybody keeps buying 30 million a year. Why would it change? Like, there's no change being that. It's all about what the customer does, because at the end of the day, it's all about profit, right? Yes, games are art, and yes, games are made for people, but if the people that are buying the game keep complaining and keep buying, nothing's gonna change. So.
Right, but there are different types of players. So I think there are many casual players that would buy, let's say, Fortnite skins or whatever. Those types of players don't actually care about the game's development scene. Like,
right.
The actual players who play the games are the ones that have been playing for long or care about story-driven games or the actual real games.
So for story-driven games, again, it's all about it's all about voting with your wallet, right? If somebody says, oh, like, I want more games like Alan Wake 2, right? But under 1 million people bought Alan Wake 2. Nobody bought it. So how are they gonna make another one? How are they gonna justify it? So it's like, you need to buy the thing you want to have to see more of, or convince your friends that are not buying it to buy it, right? If people see that I invest 100 million and I get 200 back, then okay, maybe I should do this. But if somebody sees I invest 200 and I get 1 billion back, they're gonna go for the bigger sort of, yeah.
Sure, but you as a programmer, what can you do to change the
Me
state?
as a programmer,
Is there something that,
Very
because
little.
you are the vital part, right?
yeah, but like at the end of the day, like you're just the best case scenario is you're a private company, so you don't have to answer to investors and explain that profitable option is not what we're gonna do. So that's one. And two is you are in the company long enough to have been someone who loves games, and now you're at the top, right? But that's the only way.
Right.
Are you referring to regulation? Because as far as I know, there isn't. So
Regulations or what?
game development, actual rules of playing the games. Are you referring to something like this?
We are talking about how.
Because if you leave it up to the programmer to change the game, it is something that has a purpose, and the purpose is it is a company that aims for profit. Therefore, even though the developers may have a different opinion, they will do, the thing that keeps the company and themselves alive.
The games development is an ever-changing field, so let's hope that one day it will get better, right?
I agree with you. Types of games that I like playing are not the types of games that make the most money.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
But why is that? Why is that?
I mean, like, it depends on the thing you're looking for. Some people look for. I mean, this is like psychological, so it's definitely not my expertise, right? But I like a game that makes me depressed if it's a good story, right? If it's a depressing story, but it's a really powerful story, then I want to play it. But some people just want to play 30 minutes of some game to have fun after work, or just they're not at an age group where they care enough, right? So it just depends on like what am I aiming for. It's the same thing with like filmmaking. You see something like Oppenheimer, rated at 18, made under $1 billion, and then you have Barbie that made 1.5 billion.
But they got all the Oscars.
Yes, they did get the Oscars, but at the end of the day, like when you're looking at the profit of the movie, like the target audience is just